Good morning, everyone, and thank you for turning out on this perfect Sunday morning for this really wonderful, wonderful event. I am delighted and honored to introduce Beth Macy, author of Truevine, a book that has been included on nearly every best list for 2016 and has been optioned by Leonardo DiCaprio as a film. And those of you who've read the book understand what a natural it is for the screen. Beth Macy, a native Midwesterner, grew up in Urbana, Ohio, and attended Bowling Green College in Ohio at a time when, as she's noted in an interview, when college was easily accessible to working class folks, something to remember about the power of education and its accessibility. She's claimed the South as her home for nearly half of her life. Beth has worked as a journalist for more than 25 years, reporting stories from the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. She was with the Roanoke Times for many years and currently writes occasional essays for the New York Times and contributes to other media outlets. Beth has won numerous awards for her journalism and writing, including the Nieman Fellowship for Journalism at Harvard and the J. Anthony Lucas Award for her first book, Factory Man: How One Furniture Maker Battled Offshoring, Stayed Local, and Helped Save an American Town. As the title suggests, Factory Man, in the words of one reviewer, personalizes one of the biggest economic stories of our times. In a story that ranges from the Blue Ridge Mountains to China and Indonesia, Beth traces John Bassett's tireless work to revive his company and keep his town from becoming a place of empty storefronts and for sale signs. Rick Bragg wrote Beth Macy's award-winning book, Look at One Furniture Maker's Refusal to Give Up is a breath of hope and a damn fine story to read. New York Times' Janet Maslin has described Beth Macy as, quote, a reporter who believes in the power of shoe leather, and we should add, patience and grit. The tale of how she pursued and ultimately unraveled the story at the heart of Truevine is woven throughout this remarkable, shocking, and deeply compelling book. In her search for what happened to Willie and George Muse, Beth has captured the harsh and brutal realities of life in the rural segregated South, the sideshow culture of the traveling circus, and the enduring power of a family's love and a mother's steely determination. The book is also populated with an amazing cast of characters. Truevine also illuminates the racial ideologies that structured American life and thought during the first half of the 20th century, with consequences that resonate today. Just, quote, one more white person stirring up shit, queried Nancy Saunders when Beth Macy appeared at her soul food restaurant hunting down clues. That was the start of what became a fascinating collaboration and an amazing journey, which we will have a glimpse of this morning. Please join me in welcoming Beth Macy.
Thank you so much for coming, and I wanted to thank Sue Ellen for putting this on. I understand she was so depressed after the election that she thought about not having it at all, and then decided she was coming back with a vengeance and really gonna feature a lot of these issues that that panel I was on yesterday with Carol Anderson and the others just blew me away. So I also wanted to thank Amor Tolles and his wife Maggie for hosting my husband and I this weekend. Amor and I have lost a lot of prizes together in the last year, and we've bonded over that. So it was his idea to have me come to Martha's Vineyard, and it's been a wonderful time, our first time here. Lastly, on Sunday, before I left for this trip, at 11:35 p.m., I turned in my third book. Yeah, so recently I went to the store, the grocery store. It was the first time I had been to the grocery store in about a year. And there's like new kinds of yogurt. Like there's coconut yogurt, there's mango bars. I came home and I said to my husband, I can't believe, I felt like the first George Bush when he went to the store and he didn't know you could scan. items. So which is all to say that my husband, Tom Landon, has been such an amazing support, and I'm a grocery store and whatever, but I just wanted to say that none of this gets done without a really supportive family system, and I'm really, really blessed. Thank you for talking about Factory Man 2. It was my first book. I was about 50 when I wrote it. I never thought I'd write a book, and I stumbled upon this story of this great character, a third generation, a furniture maker who sued China in a court of international trade to prove that the Chinese were dumping in our market. And he won his case. And he was a multimillionaire at birth. And he said outrageous things like, the fucking Chi-Coms aren't going to tell me to make furniture. And I thought, who is this guy? And but when you talk about resiliency, the character in the hero of my second book, Truevine, was an illiterate black maid in Jim Crow, Virginia. And you talk about grit. She makes John Bassett look like a weenie. She was such a brave person. And so this was a story about George and Willie Muse, two brothers who were born with albinism in the 1890s. And around 1900, they were kidnapped by a circus bounty hunter, and they were sold to the circus. And for 13 years, Harriet Muse didn't see her children, and not a person in power lifted a finger to help her find them. So this is the first known picture of them in the circus back when they were known as Barnum's Monkey Men. They were also known for a time as Darwin's Missing Links. They were being carted all over America from one carnival to another, sold like chattel, and virtually enslaved for 13 years. And when they cried that they missed their mother, they were told to quit crying, that their mother was dead. And eventually they are sold from one carnival to another circus, and eventually they end up with the greatest show on earth, Ringling Brothers. And that's where they are in 1927, when Ringling Brothers comes through Roanoke, Virginia, a gritty little train town, and Harriet Muse goes under the sideshow tent, much like the tents out there, and says, "Oh no, you don't." This is an arrangement of what the sideshow looked like at the time. The sideshow was designed, it was kind of a side tent off the main tent. It was designed to get another admission quarter out of the patron. And this is at a time when the circus is a dominant form of entertainment in America between 1840 and 1940. It's before movies, television, professional sports were big. And Circus Day was only number 2 in the year to Christmas Day. It was, at a time when we were industrializing and people were having jobs, and they may not have had money to go on vacation, but they had money when the circus came to town. And it was a really big deal. And people would set their alarms. If they didn't have money to go to the circus, they would set their alarms so they could catch a peek at the unloading of the hundreds of animals and the train cars when they came. So I was a young newspaper reporter back in 1989 when I first landed in Roanoke. I worked for the Roanoke Times. I wrote feature stories, and I was driving around with a white photographer who had grown up in Roanoke one day, and he said, "Well, you know what the best story in town is?" And he told me the story about George and Willie Muse. And he said, "It's the best story in town, but no one's been able to get it." And I said, "Well, why not?" And he said, "Well, the lady who takes care of them," and actually George was passed away at that time. He died in 1973. Uncle Willie was still, he was in his 90s. He would live to be 108, Willie Muse, the younger of the two brothers. And Nancy Saunders was a great niece and their caregiver. She ran a little soul food restaurant called the Goody Shop. So around 1991, I kind of waltz in there, and I'm like, "Hey, I'm Beth Macy with Roanoke Times. I'd love to write a story about your famous great uncles." And she points to a sign that a customer has handmade with a stencil and she has it on the wall. And the sign says, "Sit down and shut up." She really means it. I can buy some ribs if I want, but I'm not getting this story. And the reason is he's been exploited his whole life. He's resting. He's retired. I said, "Well, what if I write it? What if I interview him, and then after he passes away, I run the story?" She said, "Nope, no ma'am." So eventually, her mother, Dot, who was a great character in the book, her mother Dot was in the back peeling potatoes and watching The Young and the Restless. And I eventually talked Dot into talking Nancy into letting me write a food story on the restaurant, which is an amazing place, a line out the door every single day. And the menu isn't written down, you're just supposed to know, because Friday's ribs, Tuesday spaghetti, and you just come on your day. And so before Nancy knows it, I'm in the back peeling potatoes with Dot and watching the Young and the Restless, because like I saw the first episode of Young and the Restless. And Victor Newman, we both agreed, is a bad guy, because they're all the same characters still. So eventually Nancy lets me write a story for the newspaper, but she doesn't really tell us much. And then later, when I go back to the restaurant, she kind of needles me. She'll say, well, you missed one scoop, like you missed an important story point. So she's really not helping us at all. And not until I delve into the story as a book later, I started in 2013, did I really understand why she was so mistrustful of the media. And so when you look at the way the newspaper covered the reunion of the Muse brothers with their family in 1927, so the sideshow tent, if you can imagine, there was walls up on the tent, and there were no chairs, and you would come in, and the exhibits would be on the platform, and the spieler or the talker would go one person at a time, and the person would either demonstrate a trick or answer a question, and the guy would say a little bit about him. And the patrons actually walked in front of them, and it was the only place in the circus in the South where segregation broke down. So you can imagine a world in which a black maid wearing a long dress, we have a photo of her from that day, she's very tall, and makes her way to the front so that her sons, who are legally blind at birth, as most people with albinism are, can see her. And Willie elbows his little brother and says, look, Willie, there's our dear old mother. She is not dead. And they come down from the platform, and she envelops them, and then 8 police officers show up, because the Ringling Brothers don't want to give them back, because they're good money makers. That's what great money makers. And so imagine a world in which Ringling travels. They're like the Carnegies. It's like they have their own oil fields and towns named after them and railroad lines. I mean, this is like really going up against it. And yet, she brings him home. And the story goes wild. It's covered in hundreds of newspapers. And this is the way they covered it. And this is a long way of explaining why Nancy doesn't trust me and thinks I'm another white person stirring up shit. The Roanoke Times, it was on the front page for days, the story, basically never talks to Harriet Muse, quotes her in dialect, saying that they're singing, now back on the porch, singing Happy Mammy songs. The New Yorker, the next year, writes and says they finally came back to the circus because, quote, the fried chicken had given out in Roanoke. The New York Times, Iko and Iko are happy, that was their stage names, Iko and Iko, says they're finally back with the circus the following year, finally, after 10 years, they have the permission of their family to be with the circus. No explanation of the fact that they didn't have the permission of their family to begin with, and that they had been trafficked all those years, unpaid. And so the great mystery is, how does Harriet Muse do that, right? She's an illiterate maid. How does she know the circuses come to town? How does she get the nerve under that sideshow tent to claim her sons in the face of lawyers, police officers, all these people that don't want to let them go, in the same tent that just a month earlier the KKK had rallied? And it was the Robert E. Lee clan. It was the largest clavern in Virginia, and the Commonwealth's attorney, who was the top prosecutor, was the founder of that particular KKK. And I didn't understand that context when I first waltzed in my perky, my hair was dark, that's how young I was, and asked Nancy to tell me this story. And she says, you weren't ready. You didn't know what you didn't know. And that was the privilege of getting to write this book, was learning to know what I didn't know. And there were so many holes in the story about two people who were written about so many times, but never once from their point of view. And when I complained to a historian I was interviewing about this, like, I just feel like they're there, but I can't reach them because no one ever asked them what they thought. She said, if we only wrote the stories of people who were well documented, we would only write the stories of really privileged people. She said, you have to do the best you can with the photographs, with the context, with the family stories, and most of all with empathy. And that really turned it. And I realized it was a story about erasure as much as it was about what had happened to George and Willie. I spent a lot of time interviewing experts, searching through old lawsuits. So she gets it back on a Friday. On Monday, she finds an ambitious white young lawyer named Warren Messick, and she files a lawsuit against the greatest show on earth for the back wages. And that was bold too. So I did there were some legal documents, there were little clues, but I learned something I've always learned as a reporter. I've always known as a reporter, I had to sort of relearn it, that the documents only carry you so far. The best stuff was always, bar none, it was talking to people on the ground, and that's that shoe leather that Patricia talked about. It's so what I did is the family was born in Truevine, which is about an hour south of where I live, sharecropping tobacco community. And in the teens, searching for information about her sons, Harriet Muse moves to the west end of Roanoke, which was the poorest neighborhood in town then and now. It's about a 99% free and reduced lunch rate area now. And so what I did was I would interview people. I went to the church. I had a friend who went to the church who sort of vouched for me because they didn't trust me, they didn't know who I was, and I just went kind of door to door for a while, finding people who had a connection to the story or who had a memory. And what I would do is I would ask them if they would get in my car with me and let me record on my iPhone our conversations as we drove around, and they tried to remember what life had been like. Because I realized quickly that this whole question of was their life better on the road with the circus, better than the life the relatives faced at home living in a 517 square foot shack. Because they always said once they knew their mother was alive and they were able to go see her on the off season, that they were treated okay after that. But it was more complicated than that would convey. And so some of these moments where I'm driving around with ladies in their 80s, 90s, one of my main characters was 102, but just the things that they would remember of life in Jim Crow, Virginia. I think we all know about separate water fountains and separate schools, but I'm driving down this street that I've gone past a million times with the lady on the right, and she said, the Muse families lived right down there, and I lived over here, but we had to walk past this house to get to the bridge to go over to the Harrison, the all-black school. And it was just a grassy lot, but what she remembers is the Victorian house that was on that lot, and this was a white street, and back in Roanoke, it was actually, they codified in the city code which streets African Americans had to live on and which streets whites, and they would often be right next to each other. And she said, and that was a street in this beautiful Victorian house where a lady had trained her two parrots on the side porch to squawk racial epithets at us as we walked the street. Another woman told me about, I kept hearing about this slumlord, John Boswell. That was the Muse families lived in a little shack. And, oh, that's a Boswell house. And what's a Boswell house? Well, the lady on the left said that's where they would send their rent collectors around, and they wouldn't ever fix any of the houses up. In fact, someone dies there not long after, freezes to death because there's no heat in the house, and they would accept sex in partial payment for rent. And just the stories poured out, and almost to a person, these elderly people would say, People don't believe these stories. They say, even our own children and grandchildren, they say that was then, this is now, but ain't nobody making any of it up. And there was just almost this palpable desire to get these stories out. And I was just so privileged that they were willing to tell me the stories. Sometimes it took 4 and 5 visits before people would really open up to me. This is a family from Truevine, right down the road in Sontag. I met her, I was actually working on another story, and she had grown up sharecropping. This is a family that sharecropped for 3 generations, and up into the 1960s, then they went to work in the furniture factories that I wrote about in Factory Man. But they said they had heard the story growing up of George and Willie being kidnapped. And Janet on the left said she felt sorry for them, but she also remembered their story with a touch of longing. She said, only in a place like Truevine, for some of us, could the notion of being kidnapped seem almost like an opportunity. And her mother, she just turned 100, Mabel Poland, she recalled that they would feed you outdoors. They would hand the food, and the rule was no N-words in the house. So one of the gifts Nancy Saunders gave me when she let me write this book, she said, no matter what you find out in your research, because she knew I would find some really hard, some really sad and raw things, she wanted to know what they were. She wanted me to be transparent, which I was. But she wanted me to know that no matter what I found out that was hurtful, that in the end, they came out on top. And I said, okay, well, I know they came out on top because I know you took really, really good care of them. So I didn't quite know what she meant, but I knew there was something else there. And like the day I sold the book proposal, she said, because she had known I was, like the agent was putting it out, and she said, oh, Uncle Willie is really looking after you today. And and whenever I would find out something, some new little thing, some little mystery would be uncovered, I would call and I would tell her, and she would say, you better thank Uncle Willie in your prayers tonight. And so one of the things about coming out on top at the end, this is the fella who kidnapped him, the longtime manager. His name was Candy Shelton. And I knew he had died in 1974, I think it was, in Gibsonton, Florida, which is where a lot of the circus people retired. And I didn't know what happened to him. I had his death certificate. I knew where he was buried. I had a picture. It was great. But I didn't really know after the 50s what had happened to him. I tracked down 2 nephews who had lost touch with him. They had some neat memories of him from the 40s and 50s. He was the only person Uncle Willie ever said anything bad about, ever. He had a really special word that he would use for them that Nancy probably wouldn't want me to say, so I won't. But one night, my editor said, we have to know what happened to Candy Shelton. So one night, I couldn't sleep, and I was up Googling Candy Shelton on Google Books, which has all the old books online. And like, I was just like kind of punchy with it, and I just kept hitting next, next, next. Like on page 37, because everything was about Blake Shelton, right? The country singer. I wasn't interested in Blake Shelton. On page 37, there was a book that was written in the mid-70s by this writer for the Vanity Fair. It was called Florida Ramble, and it was just basically this writer went all over Florida reporting on these eccentric people that live in Florida. And he goes and he interviews all these old circus people. And there's Candy Shelton in the little kind of trailer building. And he answers the door. He's wearing like one of those wife beater t-shirts, and he's got a pot of lima beans on the stove. It's just this most evocative scene of him. And he's very lonely. He invites the writer in. He's pining for the days of the circus and the sideshow. And I just think that juxtaposition between that and George and Willie, who were so beautifully cared for, who, because of the work that their mother did making the circus pay over and over again, she spent the rest of her life getting justice for them because they would often try to not make them pay whenever they could get away with it. And she figured out a way around that. And for an illiterate maid, it just blows me away. But just that they really did come on top in the end, and I love that. So this is a story that begins in a rural, in a tobacco field, and ends with Willie's death, and really people have asked, like, so why did you call it Truevine? Well, Truevine is where they were from. But it's called Truevine because there's a Truevine Missionary Baptist Church there in this very rural crossroads. And I asked the minister there, why do you call the church Truevine? And he said it's a very important verse from the Bible for African Americans in particular, and that the first itinerant minister passing through read from that verse. I am the true vine and my Father is the vine dresser. And he said this harkens to an era when the best hope many African Americans had was for the afterlife. And it speaks to this notion that no matter what you do to us, if we have this true vine, this connection to God, then we will prevail. And lastly, one of the things I like to do is give Uncle Willie the last word, because nobody ever interviewed him, right? And so early in their careers, I'm going to play you just a very small sound recording. Early in their careers, in the 1914s, 15s, 16s, World War I was going on. And one of the things they would do, they were great musicians, but they would sing the popular songs of the day. And this really important song called It's a Long Way to Tipperary was a World War I anthem about missing home, an Irish war anthem. And it was a song that he sang his whole entire life. He sang it on the sideshow. He sang it after he had a stroke. When he was 102, I think. He had a stroke. He could no longer play his guitar, but he could hold his guitar. And there's a picture in the book of the fretboards worn down of his guitar. And after he could, so he would sing the songs. And then one day he asked Nancy to bring a cassette recorder so that when he didn't feel up to singing the songs, he could play a recording of him singing the songs. And so that's why I have this little recording. But you have to remember what he's thinking of is he's thinking of missing home, and he's thinking of his mother. So right next to his bed, he kept a picture of his mother, and every night before he went to bed, he would straighten it. And he couldn't really see. He was totally blind at the end of his life. And he would straighten the photo, and he would say to Nancy, "That's our mother. She could have been arrested. She could have been killed. She came for us." And this song, just play it, it's real short.
It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know. Goodbye, my piccalilli. Farewell, Leicester Square. It's a long, long way to Tipperary, but my heart right there.
Thank you. I'll take questions in just a sec. Just two more pictures I want to show you. People have asked, so what's Nancy think of the book, right? And so this is at the book launch party that we had a gospel choir. We had this amazing food. Nancy invited her customers from the restaurant, which had closed a few years back when she retired. Her family was there. Nancy has never told me, like, good job on the book. No. She's not going to give me that. She found a few little quibbles, and she read an earlier draft for fact checking. She found 5 or 6 things she wanted changed. That was no problem. And so I couldn't really tell what she thought. And then about a week before the party, I had asked if she still had the sit down and shut up sign, and she didn't know if she still had it. She said she would look for it, and then she didn't really get back to me on that. But at the party, one of her customers, the guy who made the sign, brought the stencil that he used to make the sign. I couldn't believe it. I was so excited. She's since then found the sign. So I said, what do you think, Nancy? What do you think? Maybe you would will me the sign? Because I really want the sign, but I didn't want to ask for the sign. And she said, I found the sign. You can have the sign after you deliver my eulogy. So she never said she liked the book, but that was pretty good. I'll take that. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, ma'am.
I wonder if you could say more about what was said about the brothers during the sideshow, if you know that, one. And then two, do I understand after the mother found them, they went back and joined
Yeah,
the circus?
yeah.
And if you can say more about what was involved in that
Yeah.
quote-unquote choice.
Great questions. So what was said about them, like in the spiel? So they were said to have been found floating off an island of Madagascar by John Ringling himself. That's when they were Iko and Iko, the Ecuadorian, the sheep-headed men. They were the Ecuadorian savages. Later, in 1923, they were found coming out of a crashed spaceship in the Mojave Desert, and that's when they were Iko and Iko, ambassadors from Mars. And just any crazy thing you could think of. And it was always like, the Dexter Fellows was a Ringling PR man, and they would call ahead and they would get newspapers to write, the circus is coming, the circus is coming. They'd give the newspaper people free tickets, and then they would basically write anything they told them to write. And it was just all a joke. Like, the New Yorker wrote about George and Willie numerous times, just always so mocking of them. And in the 30s, they wrote a series about the sideshow, and they said, we wonder if in 100 years people look, going back and reading this, they will actually think we believed all this stuff. So they even knew they were doing it. But nobody questioned this issue of trafficking or whatever. And then, so when Harriet files the lawsuit in 1927, and she wins a sizable settlement the next year, and they came home to a house that was 517 square feet, no running water, and there were already 5 people living there, and everybody was gawking at them. People were showing up on the front lawn. Somebody remembered seeing them playing music in the store window of Barnes Barnes drugstore downtown, and said they looked really sad. You have to remember, it was kind of Stockholm syndrome-y. The circus was really what they knew. I mean, they never were able to go to school. And so in the spring of 1928, after the settlement came in, it was their choice to return to the circus, but with the condition that they could come back and that they would be getting paid now. So they had a settlement for their back pay, and then they were supposed to get paid from then on. But as I said, whenever they could get away with it, they wouldn't. So one of the things that the promoter did, or Candy Shelton, is he would go to another circus, and then so the contract with Ringling would be moved. Ringling actually, once Ringling got caught, they did pay. But the other ones wouldn't. And so whenever Harriet goes back to court in 1936, she finds another lawyer, and they actually have them declared practically imbeciles, which sounds awful, like it is. This was a time of eugenics when this was happening. Hitler uses Virginia's eugenics law to justify what he does later. But this happens, and what it does is it puts a system in place in the court of guardianship. So the brothers have a guardian ad litem, and there's this system so that every month the check gets home, the lawyer gets a little piece, because the lawyer always got to get a little piece, the mother gets a piece, and the rest of it goes into a fund, a trust fund for the brothers, so that by the time they retire from the circus in 1961, there was a nice house all bought and paid for them. And this is the house that Nancy grows up in. And she has this promise that I will never, ever not take care of you, because you basically helped raise me. And when we sold the movie rights, I told her about it, and she said, Uncle Willie always did say, you will never regret taking care of me. So, but that was only to the end of her day. She died in 1939, Harriet. To the end of her day, she was fighting to get justice for her family and what had been taken from them.
You talked about Harriet as a fighter. Are there any more stories about what she was like as a person?
Oh, that's a really good question. So we know she was a domestic worker. We know she was a really, really good baker. One of the first things, the day, Willie always talked about her ash cakes, and that was like a cornbread kind of scone type thing that you would actually make in the fire. And so those were one of the things they would always talk about, like Mama's ash cakes. And then Nancy is Harriet's great granddaughter. And Nancy is also this amazing baker. So like her yeast rolls at the goodie shop, you had to call before November 1st to get your Christmas order. Like that's how popular they were. Like she and Dot would be just back there making them, like hundreds of dozens of them. And so people always said about Nancy, like you bake like her and you have guts like her. And, but there were no, other than the picture of her that was, I actually didn't have it in this slideshow. There's a picture of them on the day after they were found, and it's kind of an iconic picture taken by a kind of famous street photographer in Virginia at the time. And she's just standing there in this dress and these Oxford shoes with no laces in them. And you can see kind of the outhouse behind it. And she just looks like, oh, no, you don't. She just looks really strong.
Thank you so much. That was
Thank you.
an absolutely fascinating presentation. And thank you, and also to Patricia Sullivan and her books. The books, I think, are right here in the back. And if not back here, they're in the book sale tent. And we will be heading over to the book signing tent immediately. So please support the authors and buy the books and get them signed. Thank you.